good to see some of our same friends that we saw yesterday at our cooking demo, and also some new faces too. Hi everyone, we're so glad you could join us today for this special book talk with Rabbi Geoffrey Claussen about his new book. My name's Emma Goldblatt, and I'm excited to kick off this event on behalf of Shamayim Jewish Animal Advocacy. For those of you who may not be familiar, Shamayim is a nonprofit organization that runs programs, campaigns, and educational opportunities to teach the Jewish community about animal advocacy and veganism. We are accepting applications right now for a couple different things. The first one being our campus fellowship. So if you know a Jewish college student, you should encourage them to apply in this program, which starts next school year. They'll gain leadership skills, and we help them to bring animal advocacy to their campuses. So it's a good opportunity. If you want to bring plant-based meals and education to your community, you might consider applying for our next cohort of the Synagogue Vegan Challenge. We are also offering another program, which is the vegan versus meat debate. We'd love to bring this engaging and thought-provoking virtual debate and discussion to your synagogue or your Jewish community. It's free, and yeah, we hope that you'll consider applying. You can email me. I will put the links to all these different programs in the chat here in just a moment. And lastly, with Passover right around the corner, I want to encourage you to check out our vegan Passover guide. It's filled with lots of different resources, and we update it every year. And we also have a recording out of our vegan matzo ball cooking demo from yesterday. So yeah, I will link all of these in the chat. But with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the president and founder of Shamayim, Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz, and he will take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma, for that and for all that you do every day for this movement. Grateful to be in partnership with you and really looking forward to this learning program today. Let me tell you just briefly about Rabbi Dr. Geoffrey Claussen, who is the professor of religious studies, Laurie and Eric Sklut professor in Jewish studies and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Elon University. His books include Sharing the Burden, Rabbi Simcha Zisselziv, and the Path of Musar, published in 2015. Modern Musar, Contested Virtues in Jewish Thought, 2022. Jewish Virtue Ethics, published in 2023. And our topic today, this fascinating book, Jewish Ethics, The Basics, published just this year. And of course, issues of animals, related to animals, has to be in this, and knowing who Rabbi Dr. Geoffrey Claussen is, of course it will be. And so we're excited to look at ethics and history of ethics as it relates to animals today. Just process-wise, he's going to present for 35, 40 minutes. I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then we're going to open up the conversation to those here in the Zoom or those on the live stream, so that we can hear your questions as well. So with that, Rabbi Claussen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Yanklowitz. Thank you, Emma. And thanks to all of you for being here. So I'm excited to share a bit about this new book, Jewish Ethics, The Basics. It's an introduction to Jewish ethics in which, as Rabbi Yanklowitz said, non-human animals show up in all kinds of places. Animal ethics is only one of many topics in the book. I'll give some particular attention to the way in which that topic appears in the book, but first want to give a little bit of a broad overview of what the book is about. So this is an introduction to thinking critically about Jewish ethics. It has a very clear thesis. I argue in the book that the most basic thing to understand about Jewish ethics is that it has been constructed in different ways by different people in different contexts and for different reasons. That's a basic thing. That's the basic thing, I argue, to know before engaging in further study of Jewish ethics. Many different people and many different Jews have claimed that Jewish tradition or Jewish identity or Jewish experiences or Jewish history should guide us to certain kinds of ethical conclusions, often to very different kinds of ethical conclusions. And Jews have historically sought to advance nearly every ethical position imaginable and claim that their views represent Jewish ethics or Jewish values, Jewish teachings, Jewish wisdom, Judaism. What I argue in the book, above all, is that the critical study of Jewish ethics makes it clear that there is no single entity that can be identified as Jewish ethics or Judaism that says any one thing about any given subject. Jews have never been unified in their understandings of ethics. Jews have imagined many different sorts of Judaisms that teach very different things, and they've constructed those different Judaisms that teach different things for all sorts of different reasons, consciously or unconsciously. When people say that Jewish ethics teaches X or Y or Z about animal ethics, you should always ask, who's Jewish ethics? Or when people say that Judaism teaches X or Y or Z about animal ethics, you should always ask, who's Judaism? When you scratch the surface of any so-called Judaism, what I show in the book is that you'll always find human beings who are making the claims that are attributed to Judaism and who reflect a real range of different sorts of agendas. In this volume, I understand Jewish ethics really broadly. I define Jewish ethics as including all ideas developed by Jews that are shaped by Jewish tradition or Jewish experience or Jewish history or Jewish identity, all of those sorts of ideas about how humans should live, especially in relation to others including both humans and non-humans. Let me say that again. Jewish ethics refers to ideas developed by Jews, shaped by Jewish tradition or experience or history or identity about how humans should live, especially in relation to others. So many other people historically have tried to define Jewish ethics more narrowly in order to fit with their agendas and their convictions about what Jewishness means and what Jewish ethics should mean. And they generally seek to exclude whatever ideas they've wanted to exclude from the historical record of what counts as Jewish ethics. And part of what this book explores is how people do that, how people look at the history of Jews making claims with reference to Jewish tradition or identity or history and say, well, some of those claims are not part of the real Jewish ethics. Right? Many people looking at Jewish ethics would like to say, this is the real Jewish ethics. And you don't need to look over there at other ideas about what Jewish ethics is, often for very good reasons. Chapter 1 of my book focuses on how Jews often do that and to expose how that plays out and to help us understand what's going on there and how people go about obscuring the diversity that exists within the history of Jewish ethics for all kinds of reasons, which are sometimes very well intentioned, but which are often pretty dishonest and which are generally very misleading. One way that people seek to exclude certain voices from what counts as Jewish ethics is precisely through using the language of Judaism. To say that Jewish ethics is the ethics of Judaism, and Judaism is defined narrowly as an ism, meaning a commitment to a certain kind of approach or a certain kind of belief. And so some Jewish approaches are viewed as not belonging in, say, a book about Jewish ethics. People say things like that all the time, right? That's very nice that you see that view as a Jewish view, but that's not the ethics of Judaism. You can say whatever you want about veganism, but that's not an imperative of Judaism, right? Or whatever people might say. Jews have taken many different approaches that they've claimed are the approach of Judaism and have built many different Judaisms that reflect their different approaches. And using that language of Judaism can be really useful for convincing people to support any number of agendas, where people can say, it's not just my view, it's what Judaism teaches. But part of the goal of this book is to help readers understand that there's no stable thing called Judaism that teaches some particular thing. There are different human beings who have constructed different sorts of Judaisms that teach a really wide range of different things. Other people have taken other strategies to exclude other voices. So for example, some people say that in order to count as part of Jewish ethics, an ethical claim needs to be in line with some particular principle or some idea that's viewed as essential to Jewish ethics. Or in order to count as part of Jewish ethics, an ethical claim needs to quote certain texts that are viewed as essential to Jewish tradition. Or in order to count as part of Jewish ethics, an ethical claim needs to be marked as religious. So secular Jewish ethics doesn't count. Or an ethical claim should not be marked as too political or take certain kinds of political stances that are viewed as outside of the bounds of authentic Jewish ethics, or that in order to count as part of Jewish ethics, an ethical claim needs to be approved by certain authorities who are viewed as the proper authorities for Jewish ethics. Often, right, it needs to be certain straight cisgender male scholars of a certain race and class and whatever. Chapter 1 of this book does a lot of work to consider those dynamics of exclusion and to explore who historically has drawn the lines of what counts as Jewish ethics and why. And again, to try to avoid such exclusions in this book, but instead to try to define Jewish ethics broadly and to include all sorts of ideas that you may judge as good or judge as bad, all sorts of ideas shaped by Jewish tradition or experience or history or identity about how humans should live, whether or not those ideas are sanctioned by your particular Judaism, whether or not they advance the moral principles that you think should be essential to Jewish ethics, whether or not they quote from the texts that you think are essential, whether they're religious or secular, cultural or political, coming from whatever political perspective developed by people of any gender, sexuality, disability status, race, ethnicity, class. My book does in part seek to show that people who have often been excluded from histories of Jewish ethics have made contributions to Jewish ethics. Again, many diverse Jews have made many diverse contributions to Jewish ethics, understood broadly, which is why there is no and can't be any single essence of Jewish ethics. There are many different constructions of Jewish ethics, and making that clear is the focus of chapter 1 of this book. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. What I just described is chapter 1 of a 5-chapter book. And I'll just say a word about, oops, if I can find it, there we go. I'll just say a word about chapters 2 and 3, and then a word about chapters 4 and 5. And I'm bringing up the table of contents here. Chapters 2 and 3 are devoted to, oops, are devoted to pre-modern Jewish ethics. And chapters 4 and 5 are devoted to modern Jewish ethics. I'm just going to try to get a better view here. Chapters 4 and 5, when it comes to modern Jewish ethics, I really do showcase a very broad diversity of sources. Chapter 4 focuses on modern secular Jewish ethics, approaches that don't invoke God or theology. And chapter 5 focuses on modern Jewish theological ethics, approaches that do invoke God. And within each of those chapters, I try to bring in a really diverse array of literature with a broad range of assumptions and perspectives. In chapters 2 and 3, I decided to instead focus on a more limited number of bodies of literature on the pre-modern sources that are commonly viewed today as especially influential. So chapter 2 of this book is devoted to one very influential collection of sources, the classical rabbinic literature of the first millennium of the Common Era, especially the Mishnah and Talmudic literature, the Palestinian Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, and collections of Midrashic literature, with attention to the diversity found within all of that rabbinic literature. Chapter 3 explores 2 influential bodies of medieval literature that build on rabbinic literature, the writings of the philosopher Maimonides, written in North Africa in the 12th century, and the writings collected in the Zohar, largely written in 13th and 14th century Spain. And I especially contrast those 2 different approaches in that chapter, in chapter 3, Maimonides on the one hand, and the Zohar on the other hand. In chapters 2 through 5 as a whole, I focus on a series of issues, the same issues in every chapter, issues that I trace through these different chapters and show how different Jewish approaches consider those issues in very different sorts of ways. So the issues that I have highlighted on the screen here are the issues that show up throughout the book, which include issues regarding authority, issues regarding the status of Jews and Gentiles, issues regarding gender, race, disability, sexuality, abortion, animals and the environment, violence and war, settling the land of Israel, political governance, the rights of refugees, strangers, and others in need, and the development of compassion and other virtues. Of all of those topics, we're only going to focus on one over the next few minutes, which is the topic of animals, of non-human animals. And what I'd like to do is trace the way that non-human animals show up in different ways throughout the book to give you a taste of some of the different approaches to animals. And so I'm going to, in part, search through the book and point you to some of the places where references to animals appear to give you a sense of some of the diverse approaches to non-human animals that I see within the history of Jewish ethics, some of the diverse ways that humans have made ethical claims about non-human animals with reference to Jewish tradition, identity, history, and experience. There are too many references to non-human animals in the book to show you all of them, I realize, in the time that we have, but I'll start with showing you some of them, beginning with chapter 2, with the chapter on ancient rabbinic literature. So the first place, I just searched for the word animal here, the first place where the word animal shows up is in reference to the centrality of animal sacrifice at the ancient temple in Jerusalem, which is a major theme of much of rabbinic literature and is depicted in one tractate of the Mishnah as even being one of the pillars upon which the world stands. So Simeon the Righteous, the high priest at the temple before its destruction, teaches that the world stands upon three things: on the Torah, on the service, avodah, and on the bestowal of loving kindness. And the service, what that means might seem ambiguous, but most scholars think that here it refers explicitly to animal sacrifice, the service of animal sacrifice at the Jerusalem temple. But here I contrast that with a teaching in the same tractate by a later rabbi living after the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Simeon ben Gamliel, who teaches something different about what the world stands on. Rabbi Simeon ben Gamliel teaches the world stands upon three things: on justice, on truth, and on peace. And I note here, with reference to the scholarship of Daniel Schwartz, you can reconcile these traditions, but many readers have seen a disagreement here. Rabban Simeon ben Gamliel, or at least an editor, may be asserting that temple sacrifices can no longer be the pillar upon which the world rests. A new list of key values must be formulated. So I just want to point to that possible tension in rabbinic literature regarding the centrality of animal sacrifice, and to point out that here we already at the beginning have tension and disagreement even within one chapter of one tractate of the Mishnah. I should say that I organized this chapter around three major narratives that shape ethics in rabbinic literature, which are: number one, the revelation of Torah; number two, going back in time, the creation of the world; and number three, going forward in time, the redemption of the people of Israel from oppression. That discussion of the things upon which the world stands is part of my discussion about revelation, about ways in which rabbinic literature often highlights how Torah, revealed Torah, is filled with tensions and disagreements. For example, there, in framing the fundamental teachings revealed by God by juxtaposing two different ideas about the things upon which the world stands. Animals come up again in the discussion of Revelation in the context of explaining how rabbinic literature often develops its own principles and makes it very clear that those principles are not firmly grounded in the text of the written Torah. A good example is what I have highlighted here on the screen, is the Talmudic principle of Tsar Balei Chaim, the principle on causing suffering to animals, which you can see on the screen here. And I'll just read for you. The Babylonian Talmud sometimes insists that its ethical principles are part of God's revelation of the written Torah to Moses, even as it indicates that those principles are not actually supported by the written Torah's words. For example, the Talmud refers to a prohibition on Tsar Balei Chaim, on suffering caused to animals, generally understood as unnecessary suffering caused to animals. And I go on to discuss here how that idea gets described in the Babylonian Talmud as being from the written Torah, but as the scholar Beth Berkowitz points out, the editors of the Babylonian Talmud seem to use that phrase above all to mean it's a really serious concern, not that it's a principle that can easily be derived from the text of the written Torah. This here is just one example of how the rabbis advance the idea that God's Torah is revealed through their development of the oral Torah and how they assert their authority to develop God's Torah. There's more to say about that, but I'm going to move forward to the discussion of creation narratives as a source of ethics in rabbinic literature. So one of the ideas that I discuss in this section is the idea that there are a series of traditions about 7 commandments that are given to human beings at the dawn of creation, or that are embedded in the fabric of creation. And I just want to highlight where animals show up there. So in one tradition, one of the initial commandments given to human beings is a prohibition on eating a limb from a living animal. And then there's also another tradition about the initial commandments given to humanity, which seems to refer to animals even more, including a prohibition on castration, seemingly also applying to animals, and onto the next page here, a prohibition on crossbreeding, which also seems to concern animals. As the scholar Mira Wasserman points out, it's remarkable that in this tradition, 3 of the first 7 commandments given to human beings seem to be about the treatment of non-human animals. I'm just going to leave that there for now and skip ahead to the question of the permission to eat animals in rabbinic literature. So I'll read briefly here from this section on creation and the treatment of non-human animals. Rabbinic teachings on the treatment of non-human animals are also sometimes framed with reference to creation. For example, the permission for humans to eat animals, though for Jews only a small number of species, is justified on the grounds that God abandoned God's requirement at the dawn of creation that humans be vegetarian. And here's a passage from the Babylonian Talmud. Rav Judah said in the name of Rav, the first human being was not permitted to eat meat. As it is written, God says, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit for you and for every animal of the earth, they shall be for food. But the animals of the earth are not food for you. But when the children of Noah came, generations later, God permitted them to eat meat, as it is stated, every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. As with the green grasses, I give you all these. Some rabbis, I say here, may have viewed vegetarianism as God's original ideal, fit for a world in which death did not yet exist, as the scholar Yael Shemesh argues. But others may well have believed that even the first human beings were permitted to eat meat. After all, according to the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan discussed above, the prohibition on eating a limb from a living animal was given in the Garden of Eden. Such a prohibition would seem to suppose that other forms of eating meat were permitted even there. And some rabbis evidently believe that non-human animals were created for the sake of human beings. One famous question asked in the Mishnah, were they not created only to serve me? Rabbi Simeon ben Elazar asks. He's assuming that the answer is yes. But other sources seem to challenge this idea. For example, the Talmud describes Rabbi Judah in a famous story as punished for telling a calf that it was created for the sake of slaughter. I'll go ahead and read the first part of this here. The sufferings of Rabbi Judah the patriarch, the Talmud teaches, came due to an incident. What was it? Once there was a calf that they were bringing to slaughter. It went and hung its head in a corner of Rabbi Judah's garment, and it cried. Rabbi Judah said to it, go, for this you were created. The heavenly court said, since he shows no compassion, let sufferings come upon him. It is only later that Rabbi Judah realizes in the coda of the story here, upon seeing his maid sweeping the house and threatening baby rats, or whatever exactly the species is, Rabbi Judah said to her, "Let them go. It is written, God's compassion is upon all of God's works." They said, "Since he shows compassion, we will have compassion upon him." Those are just some views of animal ethics in rabbinic literature that are tied to creation narratives. When I move from writing about creation to writing about redemption, the treatment of animals comes up just once there. And that's just in the context of imagining what a redeemed world would look like. I just note what's highlighted there on the screen. Many sources imagine the restitution of animal sacrifices at a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, even if one rabbinic text, imagines that sacrifices other than Thanksgiving offerings will be abolished. That's just one brief peek into chapter 2, into some ways that different ancient rabbinic authors engage with animals in different sorts of ways. As I spend some time making clear, these are just some of the many ancient Jewish approaches to animals. None of them represent the view of Jewish ethics or the view of Judaism. They represent just some approaches constructed by the ancient rabbis. In the next chapter, in chapter 3, I move into Maimonides and the Zohar. There's a lot that shows up in the teachings of Maimonides about animals that I discuss here, including the idea highlighted here on the screen about worshiping God through animal sacrifice. Maimonides famously views animal sacrifice as the center of worship, as a concession. As I put it here in the book, they, the people of Israel, were commanded to worship God by sacrificing animals because this was one of the practices to which they were accustomed. Though elsewhere Maimonides speaks of the Torah's perfection, he here recognizes that it is filled with concessions and imperfections. That's part of how Maimonides thinks about revelation, the revelation of Torah, that the teachings of the Torah accommodate human weaknesses and customs and social circumstances. And as I go on to discuss, how he sees what the Torah does offer is in part that it offers commandments that will improve people's moral character. And he says this in part with regards to commandments regarding animals. So I'll read just briefly here. Maimonides views many of the commandments of the Torah as explicitly aiming at cultivating moral character. For example, the commandment prohibiting causing unnecessary suffering to non-human animals, which includes a prohibition on killing for sport. This is the language of Maimonides. He says that commandment is set down with a view to perfecting us so that we should not acquire moral habits of cruelty and should not inflict pain needlessly without any utility, but that we should intend to be kind and merciful even with a chance animal individual, except in cases of need, for we must not kill out of cruelty or for sport. The Torah's prohibitions on eating meat, unless it is slaughtered in the most painless manner, or on slaughtering a mother and her young on the same day, or on taking a mother's bird's eggs or chicks before her eyes, are also linked with the prohibition on causing suffering, and so to the concern with building habits of cruelty. In these contexts, Maimonides points to the importance of sensitivity to the suffering of non-human animals. He says animals feel very great pain, there being no difference regarding the pain between man and the other animals. Also, the reason for the prohibition against eating a limb cut off from a living animal is because this would make one acquire the habit of cruelty. Maimonides sees human consumption of animals as justified by health concerns, but he sees the Torah's regulations as ensuring compassion and reducing cruelty. Maimonides' concerns for non-human animals may be linked with his conviction that according to the Torah, all species, quote, have been intended for their own sakes, not to serve human beings. It's important to see, though, that Maimonides does not imagine a future without animal sacrifice. So, for example, as you can see highlighted here, Maimonides imagines, on the topic of redemption, he imagines that in the days of the Messiah, animal sacrifices will be reestablished at the temple in Jerusalem. Animal sacrifice as the path to worshiping God may be a concession, but Maimonides does not argue that therefore animal sacrifices should be abolished. But he does view animal sacrifice as a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. And that creates a stark contrast between the teachings of Maimonides and the teachings of the other literature discussed in this chapter of the book, in chapter 3, which are the teachings of the Zohar. And just to make that contrast, I'll read briefly from the highlighted text here. Whereas Maimonides viewed animal sacrifices as concessions that would serve as means to certain ends, the Zohar describes animal sacrifice as uniting God's masculine and feminine parts. Whereas Maimonides framed a number of the Torah's laws pertaining to the use and slaughter of animals as decreasing cruelty, the Zohar refers to cosmic ramifications. Notably, it understands one of these laws as in fact encouraging cruelty towards animals in ways that benefit the people of Israel. One passage in the Zohar describes how shooing away a mother bird before taking her eggs or chicks will hopefully cause distress to the mother bird and to the guardian angel for birds, which will in turn cause God to reason that the people of Israel are far more deserving of compassion and to do nothing for the bird, but instead to show compassion towards Israel. This passage suggests that deliberately acting with cruelty towards an animal can, in fact, help one's people. That's just another take on that commandment to shoo away the mother bird. All of these pre-modern views are constructions of Jewish ethics that depict God as the source of ethics in one way or another, especially with reference to God's revelation of Torah and God's creation of the world and God's promises for a redeemed future. I want to take you briefly into chapter 4 of the book, which takes us into modern traditions of secular Jewish reasoning about ethics, traditions that do not justify ethics with reference to God or any theological categories, but that make ethical claims with reference to Jewish identity or Jewish history or Jewish experience. You can see some examples of how animals show up in that discourse here, and I'll jump in here with one controversial framing about how ideas about Jewish history have shaped Jewish animal ethics. I note here, Jewish thinkers have also drawn parallels between the Holocaust and cruelty towards animals. The Polish-American fiction writer I.B. Singer drew particular attention to these parallels through the statement in one of his stories that in relation to animals, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. The legal scholar Sherry Kolb, writing as the child of Holocaust survivors, has criticized cheap comparisons between the Holocaust and animal rights abuses, but argues that we should not close our eyes to important parallels between those who felt entitled to murder Jews and those who feel entitled to kill animals. Drawing on insights from Singer and from the Holocaust survivor and animal rights activist Alex Hershoft, Kolb advocates for Jewish veganism and concludes that we serve justice, this is her language, we serve justice when victims identify with other victims and extend the compassion and justice that should rightly have been extended to them to the rest of sentient creation. Others advocating for animal rights have drawn on other aspects of Jewish literary and artistic history. The Israeli scholar Hadass Marcus, for example, and is drawing from the book Jewish Veganism and Vegetarianism, which Rabbi Yanklowitz co-edited. The Israeli scholar Hadass Marcus points to concerns for animal welfare in the writings of figures such as I.B. Singer, the 19th century English thinker Louis Gompertz, the Yiddish author Mendele Machasforim, the Bohemian Jewish writer Franz Kafka, and in the art of the Belarusian French painters Chaim Soutine and Marc Chagall. Secular Jewish artists and writers such as these, she says, conveyed their heartfelt pity for innocent chickens, sheep, goats, and cows with their paintbrushes and their pens, and in Marx's view, promote compassion for non-human animals. That's just a little snippet of some framings of Jewish animal ethics that do not involve God language or theological concepts like creation and revelation and redemption. But chapter 5 of the book, the final chapter, shows that a lot of modern Jewish ethical discourse does invoke God and does invoke creation and revelation and redemption in all kinds of ways and with all kinds of ethical ideas in mind. I'm going to skip over some of those for the sake of time, but I'll go ahead and skip to the section on ideas about love and compassion, where you'll get to see a familiar figure here. So here's how Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz shows up in this section here. And I think this is a good passage for seeing how some of the ethical ideas from Maimonides and from the Zohar show up in some modern Jewish ethical discourse. I'll read just a little bit here. The contemporary American modern Orthodox Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz is among those who have stressed the obligation to cultivate love and compassion, not only for human beings, but also for non-human animals. For Yanklowitz, the Torah's commandment to have compassion for non-human creatures is reflected in its prohibition on causing unnecessary suffering to animals. We saw in chapter 3 that Maimonides viewed a number of the Torah's commandments as linked with this commandment, preventing habits of cruelty and cultivating compassion, and Yanklowitz builds on this tradition. While he argues that compassion for animals should encourage a vegan lifestyle, he sees the commandments of the Torah as seeking to cultivate compassion towards animals, even as they condone the use of animal products. Thus, for example, the commandment to shoo away a mother bird before taking her eggs or chicks teaches us, quote, to be mindful of the pain we cause animals and to do everything we can to prevent their unnecessary suffering. We may contrast Yanklowitz's understanding of this particular commandment with modern Jewish approaches that see the commandment regarding the mother bird as an antiquated text, lacking compassion, that should not be valued at all. And on the other hand, we may draw a contrast with modern Jewish approaches that follow the Zohar's interpretation of this commandment discussed in chapter 3. In line with that interpretation, some modern Jewish thinkers have argued that one should intentionally cause distress to mother birds on the grounds that acting with cruelty towards them will bring divine compassion to the people of Israel. That's not just a medieval idea, but also an idea that continues to be developed by modern Jews as well. Later in the chapter, I also discuss how ideas about creation narratives have shaped modern Jewish animal ethics, and I'll read just a little bit from that section, especially highlighting, I'll read here, Jewish thinkers have also drawn on creation narratives in addressing the treatment of non-human animals. The American modern Orthodox Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik pointed to the Torah's ideal of vegetarianism and subsequent concession made to an evil drive when God agreed to permit the, quote, murder of animals. Ben Ami, the leader of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, advocated for veganism as the diet of the Garden of Eden, quote, in harmony with the will of the Creator. The American scholar Aaron Gross explored ways in which, quote, divine concern for the sanctity of all life is upheld in biblical creation narratives as well as in later Jewish literature. Gross also points to the agency of animals themselves in challenging human understandings of creation, as with the calf, who responds with gestures and tears to Rabbi Judah's assertion that, quote, for this you were created. But other Jewish thinkers have advanced a dominionist ethic, claiming that animals were created to benefit human beings. And that's just a taste of some of the diversity there. I also go on to discuss how modern Jewish thinkers have drawn on ideas about the original commandments given to human beings at the dawn of creation or in the days of Noah. So, for example, understanding that the commandment not to eat from a living animal is actually a prohibition for all human beings on cruelty to non-human animals, or the idea developed by the scholar Mira Wasserman, holding up the ancient tradition that sees 3 of the first 7 commandments as pertaining to animals, which Wasserman says helps to align humans with other species. As I say here, while Wasserman raises moral concerns with this tradition, she sees it as providing encouragement for developing a Jewish ethics that honors human entanglements with other species, that cultivates our attachments and fellow feeling, and that honors our own animal selves. And to conclude, I'll offer just one more example of a modern Jewish ethical idea grounded in creation narratives. One of the ideas about creation that weaves its way through other parts of the book is the idea that only human beings, or only some human beings, were created in God's image, and that only certain human beings, or only human beings but not non-human animals, should be regarded as holy. A different perspective here comes from the scholar and Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, and I'll read what I have highlighted here. Belzer notes how the idea of creation in God's image is used to claim that humans are more holy than other animals, ignoring the way that other species also mirror the divine. In Belzer's own conception of the idea of God's image, God reflects each one of us. Human beings, in all our radical particularity, offer 100,000 windows, she says, into holy possibility. God's gender is non-binary, stone butch fairy, and 1,000 words we haven't named. God knows wheels and blindness from the inside. God has felt a runner's high and the exhilaration of the climb. God is deaf, God is black, God is brown, God is queer. And to our topic here, it isn't only humankind. The dolphin's God has a dorsal fin. God is kin to us, to each of us, with all the paradox that this implies. All of this is to say, and I'll step out of the book here, that when you look at the history of Jewish ethics, at the different ways that different Jews have developed ideas about how to live in relation to others with reference to Jewish tradition or experience or history or identity, you will find many different ideas. As with all the other topics in this book, none of the ideas about animal ethics discussed here are the Jewish view or what Judaism teaches or what Jewish ethics says. They are ideas developed by particular people in particular contexts for various sorts of reasons. This here is just a very brief tour of some of the ideas that refer to non-human animals in this book. There's more in the book about non-human animals, and there's also a lot more in the book about a wide range of other topics, as you saw at the beginning of our time together, that show a lot of diversity about a lot of different issues. But I hope that this whets your appetite for more. I hope you'll check out or buy a copy of the book, whether a print copy or a digital copy or the audiobook, which is coming out this month. And thanks for joining me on this brief tour of the book. And I will pass the mic back to Rabbi Yanklowitz.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Claussen. So awesome to learn from you. And I want to encourage everyone to pick up this very exciting book, and his previous ones, which are amazing as well. And I will ask a few questions now and then open up the conversation. If you want to wait to unmute yourself, you can do that. If you also want to submit a question through the chat, you can do that, or through the live stream, you can send it to us through the live stream. So to start, you've shared all these historical points about how people have made moral claims about animals in the past. How much moral weight does that history have? Thinking as as an ethicist, how should people make use of the past to inform their moral commitments today?
Yeah, so thank you. I don't I don't think there's anything inherently good or inherently sacred about ideas simply because they are part of the historical record. But I think that we can learn a tremendous amount about the past. I think there's a lot of moral wisdom in the history of Jewish ethics. I think we should seek to learn from that wisdom. But at the same time, there's also a lot that's really morally troubling in the history of Jewish ethics, and we should object to that. Since I focused on just animal ethics over the past half hour, that it may not be entirely clear, although maybe to some of you from what I shared, but I'll share that maybe especially with a host of other issues, this book really does not try to sweep anything under the rug. I try to be really intellectually honest as best I can in exploring the diversity of Jewish ethics. I try to show a really wide range of views, including a lot of views that readers will see as really horrifying. And different people I know will see different views as horrifying, but for example, including a lot of views that are really misogynistic and xenophobic and racist and cruel. I think it's important to be honest in seeing those traditions alongside traditions that are feminist and universalistic and egalitarian and compassionate. I think it's valuable to look at the past honestly. That's not because ideas have weight simply because someone has claimed that they're authentic or that they are Torah or that they're what Jewish ethics teaches. Jewish ethics doesn't teach any one single thing, and so we need to make choices about how to respond to the diversity of the past. And we have the responsibility, I think, to approach the past with good principles in mind and to approach the past with virtues of compassion and with justice and with honesty and with courage, among other virtues. and to take guidance from traditions that offer good principles and that do help to create a world of greater compassion and justice. I'll say that, I mean, when it comes to animal ethics, the principle that I also in the book here showed you raising up, which I think you did well, the principle that one should not cause unnecessary suffering to any animal is, I think, a good moral principle that we can learn from the past. And then with compassion and justice in mind, we can use that principle to make judgments about other sorts of historical claims. If someone says, I need to torment this mother bird because that will bring about redemption, and that's what Jewish ethics teaches, it's right here in the Zohar, right? You might say, number one, that's not what Jewish ethics teaches. That's one construction of Jewish ethics developed by particular human beings at a particular moment. But Jewish ethics does not speak with one voice. And number two, we are prohibited from causing tsar ba'alei chayim, from causing unnecessary suffering to animals. And if you think that the suffering you want to cause is necessary, you need to be able to make a really good argument as to why it's necessary. And just because the Zohar says something is not good enough to make your case.
Great. How would you think about pluralism as it relates to ethics in regards to us creating policy? Let's say if we pushed for vegan synagogues or pushed for certain legislation, um, how would you think about, kind of making a primary claim that the Jewish ethical thrust is one that leans towards not consuming non-human animals? And how does that change given the fact that high majority of Jews, high majority of humans, don't give much moral concern to, animals or the consumption of animals at all?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So one more wise idea from the past, I think, that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. I think Maimonides was onto something in suggesting that the Torah must always take into account where people are and what people are capable of. And Torah must always needs to speak in a way that people can understand. And more generally, all of us who are making policies or who are communicating ethical ideas to other people, however we do that, I think we do need to take into account where people are and what they care about and what they don't care about and how they'll understand and what they seem to be capable of and what they might not be capable of. I do think that people are often more capable of change than they might appear at first glance. Right, Moses, as Maimonides imagined him, may have been right to conclude that his people would never have come to serve God without slaughtering animals. We're probably in a different place today, where a lot of people in the world are capable of recognizing the possibilities of living without slaughtering or torturing animals, or even the possibilities of living in a way that respects animal rights. So I do think it's important to recognize that most people don't care much about animal rights and to speak about animal rights in a way that people can hear. And it's also important to have the courage of our convictions, and to recognize that really tremendous change is possible. I think that is one thing that reading this book can help to make clear. I hope the book really does show how at various moments of history, including in the Talmud and including among modern Jewish feminist thinkers and including in the Zohar and whatever else, like radically new approaches to Jewish ethics have arisen all of the time in history. The idea that creation in God, the narrative of creation in God's image should lead to a prohibition on slavery, like that's a radical suggestion that, like, I don't know, came to transform how people today think about Jewish ethics, and required like a lot of courage for people to say, like, even if like, even if the Torah doesn't say this, even if older traditions don't say this at all, like we think it must be the case. So to the idea that like Jewish ethics requires gender egalitarianism, those are radically, and so many other ideas are radically new ideas. And I think it's important to respect where people are and the diversity of people. And personally, I have this kind of moderation and caution about pushing people too hard. But I also really admire the ways that people with a lot of courage are able to push forward and create really incredible change.
Awesome. Thank you. One last question for me, then we'll open it up in regards to virtue ethics as it relates to indirect harm. One might say a virtue ethics approach to being compassionate towards animals works when we're directly engaging with non-human animals. That, I mean, just to walk up to a dog or kick them, or to stab a cow, feels cruel. But what about as food consumers? How do we think about the cultivation of virtue when our engagement is so much more indirect? Is it accurate to even talk about compassionate eating?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a real challenge to cultivate compassion when someone who's suffering is not right in front of us. Um, that's a that's an issue that shows up that doesn't really show up in this book, but a topic that I've written about elsewhere. I think it's a real challenge, and there's a lot of work to do to help make that possible. I think there's a lot, like when you can't imagine the suffering that led to uh, you know led to an item that's on your plate or that's on a grocery store shelf. Um, right, it's really hard to bring to mind for most people, to bring to mind that suffering, to bring an awareness of suffering into our hearts. One of the figure who I wrote my first book about, Simchas Eve, as you know, one of the reasons that I found him a really compelling figure to think with was there's a 19th century rabbi, part of the Musar movement in Lithuania, which one example of a Jewish thinker who did a lot of work focused on that problem of sort of um, helping make patterns of Jewish life be about or center on the practices of bringing the suffering of others into your mind and helping them to stick there, and taking time and creating rituals in the course of a day to remind ourselves of the suffering of others. So I think it's really hard work. I think it's really hard to bring that awareness to others. And I think and I hope that there's a lot that we can do to help make that possible.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, friends, let's open up the questions. If anybody wants to unmute, we can start there. Oh, yes, Dr. Janie Heydrich. Hello.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for today. I really appreciate so much of what you said. I mean, everything of what you said. I'm a Goya, so I look at the Torah as I would any other text and think, well, at this point in my life, I would have thought this. Later in my life, I would have thought that. And now I would have thought this. And I think that's one of the beauties of Judaism, is that if you think something that's different from the Torah, you're not expelled, you're not told that you're not Jewish. You're just, part of the 15 people who have this different opinion about the same text. And there's room for everyone under the tent of interpretation. I also look at the Torah as thinking maybe as we evolve, we look less at the process and the rituals and the detail, but more sensitivity to the underlying values. And that's what governs our interpretation and our actions. And I want to say about the last the last bit, and you've referred to the sentient non-human animals. The more we learn about that, the less likely we are to eat them, and instead build a kinship or feel that kinship with other non-human animals. So this is all boiling down to a question, believe it or not. Um, I, I can't, I mean, there's everything wrong in my mind with the slaughter of animals. The gamut from cruel slaughter of the animals to people not realizing what's going on their plate, as you said. So what would you tell us individually as a group? How do we get that message across? Obviously, not everybody is ready to hear it or apply it or understand it. But what would you suggest that we do individually or as a group to promote the non-slaughter, the non-cruelty to non-human animals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have a great answer. I think Shamayim as an organization may, and other organizations that are really devoted to sort of doing the most effective things. I think that continuing to raise these issues publicly to others, and again, in ways that people can hear, does have power. And I think that creating institutional change does also have real power, creating social environments where the norms are to, I don't know, to have a plant-based default option. I think that there's a lot that happens through sort of building social environments to promote a certain kind of behavior that then help people think about those behaviors and help to build habits of virtue within people. Those are some of the strategies. And I think that there is a lot to do with on the topic that Rabbi Yanklowitz just asked about sort of bringing images of suffering to people's minds. I think there is a lot that images can do. And obviously images don't always work, and how to use images is images of suffering is can be really difficult. So I don't have great answers, but especially I think that institutional change really can go a long way. I'll just say regarding the question of Jewishness being embracing and there's room for everyone. There are some ways in which this book really encourages that thought, and there are some ways in which this book really gives a lot of examples of models of Judaism that are really not embracing, and that are really not pluralistic, and that are really where there's really not room for everyone. So on the one hand, it shows that, like, Jewish ethics has been constructed in lots of different ways by different people, and on the other hand, like, part of what I do in doing that is show a lot of models that are really highly exclusionary in all sorts of ways. So yes, on the one hand, perhaps so, and not always. And there's no clear trajectory either of, like, Jewish communities becoming more inclusive over time. Yeah, that's part of the issue that the book also addresses.
So with that, I want to thank everyone, including Rabbi Geoffrey Claussen, for doing this program with us today. I feel like we just scraped the surface, but if you want to learn more, I put the link for his book in the chat, and then I'll put it wherever this video is posted online. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.